podcast dedicated to the music, movies, and culture of Generation X.
What is up, slackers? And welcome to another episode of the Stuck in the Middle podcast. I am your host, Jason Eck, and this week is definitely going to be a little bit on the nerdy side. I'm going to be very, very honest. This is definitely a nerdy one. But before we get started, kind of give a couple of shout outs to some interesting people on the internet. I guess really one, but I don't know if any of you are familiar with Lad Bible. But Lad Bible Ireland, it's a UK based social media, YouTube, etc. They do kind of fun different videos. And I think primarily a majority of the individual contributors are oftentimes millennials, and I think probably at this point occasionally some Gen Z as well. Like the early 20-somethings are Gen Z now. And I posted it on my Instagram story, just the link and information. And there was this young man who was Irish brogue, which I won't deign to do because I won't do it well. Welcome to Lad Bible. I don't know what. What was that? Oh, top of the morning to you, laddies. Welcome to another episode of Stuck in the Middle podcast. I'm your host. Anyway, but he, hey, my 23andMe says I am hella Irish, and UK, some Scottish, Wales, all that's in there. One of our really good friends is from Ireland, and one of the funniest things that she ever said was she was babysitting our kids, and at the time we were trying to I think it was my daughter when this happened was giving up her binky, right? So anyone who has used pacifiers with children, I mean, there's a lot of different schools of thought about whether you should or you shouldn't. We happened to go that route. It was a form of self-soothing. Obviously, it is kind of like saying, hey, here's a bottle for you always. But for like bedtime, the kids would have their binkies, or if they were getting, super upset about something, and it would just be an opportunity. Okay, here you go, chill out. Well, like anything else, it becomes somewhat of a dependency. And if you've ever had to have a kid who was maybe less than willing to give up their binky, you might have a problem. So my daughter found a way, and like I said, I believe it was my daughter, to have strategically placed them, right? And I guess she looked guilty or something, and our friend with her Irish accent goes, oh, and I found her in the corner with her binky, and I didn't know if she was supposed to have it, or, she was like one of those secret smokers, and she's hiding them away. Anyway, it was hilarious, and it's just always struck with me. Oh, I thought she was a secret smoker, except it was, her binky. Anyway, so the Lad Bible, this young man is doing an analysis of generation. So man on the street, right? And I'm sure he got their permission first, but he had found someone who was, clearly a boomer, and he would stand next to them and go, now we're going to analyze generation, millennials or boomers, and going into, his analysis of boomers, etc. Now, the funniest thing is when he does Gen X, so he would edit it with different people, right? So the narrative, he probably repeated it in front of each person, right? And the magic of editing, he would then, piece all these things together for a full cohesive narrative. And the last person under the Gen X one was actually Gen Z. And he's like, and Gen Z is the mirror image of Generation X without all the childhood trauma and a working understanding of TikTok. And it just made me laugh so hard out loud, because my kids do tend to have, now obviously they're being raised by Gen X parents, some similarities, I think, in a lot of ways. I think I mentioned it before that, I think even last week maybe, that what kids are getting into nowadays. Yeah, it was last week, because I was talking about what you can or can't do nowadays. I will say this. and I won't get too much into it really, but we've definitely had a rough week and a half, 2 weeks as parents, just dealing with some things that just as parents, sometimes we face things that maybe we didn't anticipate, and, just some things that our kids have gotten into that inevitably yield a certain amount of, I want to say guilt, it is kind of the primary feeling of feeling as though we haven't given our kids all the tools to deal with certain things, or if we haven't prepared them properly, or somehow we've failed them. And, by and large, we've talked to a lot of people, both professional and just, friends, family, etc. And, they've all assured us, particularly those with older kids. And we do have some close friends who are into social work and family matters, because we're just looking to get some insight and some understanding. And yeah, I mean, it's hard parenting. It truly is. And what was so fascinating is that the kid that I was the most worried about, is my oldest, who's off at college. And almost universally, people have talked about how, he's always been very centered in self. Now, I don't know if that's like always centered in self, but he certainly has had a pretty good understanding of self. And when you don't, excuse me, I guess if you're really rooted in a firm sense of your absolute identity, this is me, it makes things a lot easier. Now, I wish I had that kind of confidence when I was his age. And I think my younger kids, they fit into these certain roles. And I think anyone who has family with multiple kids, you definitely have this, oldest, middle, youngest. There are these dynamics that exist, and they're very real. They're very true. But anyway, parenting's hard. So all of us who are doing it, I guess you sometimes just have to, you got to forgive yourself, and you got to give yourself a little bit of a pat in the back for the things you do well. And, you just hope that you have given them the tools to be resilient and to kind of overcome things. So anyway, let's get into the topic for this evening. So I am a self-described nerd, geek, what have you. And I talked about it, and you can check it out on an earlier episode where I talked about has Gen X damaged culture? We've infantilized pop culture, and we have adults who are watching cartoons, and I have more than my share of graphic tees, including anime t-shirts. Like it's very much a part of us, I think. Not universally. There are some people who aren't interested in those things at all. But I think many Gen Xers, we are pop culture junkies. And that extends to music, movies, culture, TV, just about everything, I think. So we have sometime in the next 2 years, I believe, a complete revamp of the DC Comics movie universe. So unless you've been living under a rock for the past decade or so, Marvel has dominated on the big screen, starting with Iron Man, going all the way through, new releases. Although critics and moviegoers have somewhat savaged the most recent one, the Marvels, but here you are in phase 2, and basically it's like they're starting all over again. DC, on the other hand, certainly has had some big blockbusters, big box office, but really we're most dominant on the small screen. So the CW network is basically the home of the Arrowverse, and briefly the show Supergirl, which was on NBC, came on over to the CW permanently when it was canceled over at NBC. I believe they're all owned by Viacom or whoever owns these things now. Honestly, does Warner Brothers Discovery own all that? Probably. So you had basically one figurehead over at Marvel the whole time, Kevin Feige, and he kind of developed this whole roadmap for what they were going to do from, Iron Man straight through, your Infinity War and, Endgame, all of it, right? They had this roadmap of how they were going to go ahead and make all of their titles sequential and kind of work within each other. DC really didn't do that, but what they did do was put all of their eggs, at least in one point, into the Zack Snyder basket. So I'm going to stop right there with Zack Snyder, 1966, a Gen Xer. But first, let's take a quick dive into really the flagship character of the DC Universe. One that has had mixed results, both in print, on TV, in movies. And that's really the name of this episode for tonight, is that they've moved on from Zack Snyder and have now brought in James Gunn. So James Gunn, I think, became really internationally widespread known for the Guardians of the Galaxy series. And we'll talk about that in a minute, somewhere within this podcast, of why that's important and what that's done, I think, for his reputation, but why he might be the person who can save Superman. So that's the question that I have positioned for tonight, is can James Gunn save Superman? So for anyone who doesn't know who Superman is, Superman was first published all the way back in 1933. Now, Jerry Siegel, Joe Shuster, they were the guys who wrote the artwork, all of it, and it was a story called The Reign of the Supermen. And you had a bald villain, which would later kind of morph into what we would kind of know as Lex Luthor. But he was a bald villain with telepathic powers. And, he was just, it wasn't really explained, right? You just knew that he was a strong man from another planet, right? And he secretly was mild-mannered reporter Clark Kent. So you know all this, right? But they couldn't get it sold. But eventually it was sold. 1938, it was sold, and Superman was introduced in Action Comics #1. And Secret Identity, Clark Kent, Lois Lane, all of it, right out of the gate. And then in 1939, you had Superman #1. So obviously I wasn't born yet, so I don't come into the comics realm until probably, and I remember this very, very clearly. Now, I didn't get it first run, if you will. It was something that I had received probably around 4 or 5 years old. And that was, I remember seeing Superman versus Muhammad Ali. That was 1978. So Muhammad Ali at this point is a legend. He is a superstar. He's an icon, right? And he is the great champion of Earth, almost, if you will. And I don't really remember the story exactly how they positioned the two of these super heavyweights to fight, but think about how, deified Ali was in boxing circles, but not just boxing circles, in American culture. Muhammad Ali was the man. And here he was facing Superman, right? So this is where I come in. So for the longest time in the 1940s and 1950s, the main artist for Superman was a gentleman by the name of Wayne Boring. Now, Wayne Boring had a very classic, of the time, artwork style. Superman had a very stocky build because the old, strong men, this wasn't like how you think of someone like a Schwarzenegger, a Lou Ferrigno, right? These guys who had these massive arms and chest, but and I think Schwarzenegger is one who somewhat made it trendy to have the really, slim waist, and you have these huge, delts and traps, right? Just really well defined down to this slim waist, right? But back then, the strongmen were a little bit more boxy, right? So they didn't have this super thin waist. Sure, your guys like your Jack LaLannes did, but usually big barrel chested, big arms, but they're very stocky. They didn't have a lot of, definition that we come to think of with, the modern bodybuilder. They were strong men, not bodybuilders, right? And Wayne Boring's style was very much like that. And, you have the classic hairstyle, slick back, on the side, little curl. But for me, the artist of my youth from the, 70s through, so I started reading comic books with my grandfather. So somewhere around 78, around 4 years old. So 78, 79 through about 1986. My artist growing up was Curt Swan. Now, Curt Swan took over for Wayne Boring, had a similar style early on, but gradually, as times have changed and artwork was changing, he always kept progressing. There was constantly an evolution in his artwork, and I always found that really appealing because you see an obvious growth in his work as you go from the 60s into the 70s into the 80s, and just always really impressive. But he was my Superman artist. I got to be honest with you, I don't even always remember who the writers were because it was all about the artwork. That's what I loved. Now, around the same time, the only other thing I was reading on a regular basis, so the only real, Marvel comic I read when I was little was Peter Parker, Amazing Spider-Man. Love Spider-Man, but ultimately my guy was Superman. I mean, that was it. Sure, Batman and the Justice League, these are all comics that I got, but Superman was, I don't want to say stuck in a rut, but certainly Marvel at this point was telling very different stories. Not to say that DC didn't have, they definitely had a run with like Green Lantern and Green Arrow where it was more adult oriented, getting into more real world stories, drug addiction, abuse, violence, different types of villains. With a little bit more sadistic tendencies, right? Where with Superman, it was always the kind of over-the-top stuff. Your superhero bad guys like Metallo, right, who had a kryptonite heart. Or you had the Parasite, who could literally drain someone's life force. You had Lex Luthor, of course, who's a super brainiac, who had to use his brain's technology, who, for the longest time, was looking to get back at Superman for something that happened when he was Superboy, which ultimately caused Lex Luthor to lose his luxurious red hair. That was a whole piece of like why Lex Luthor hated Superman, was because he was traumatized by having, been forced to be bald because of a chemical accident due to Superboy, right? That's your big bad origin story. And sometimes that's all it takes for a good origin story. That one bad day, that one bad experience that twists someone to become a supervillain. You also had Brainiac, who at that time looked completely different than, the late or I guess mid. I'm trying to remember when they went ahead and revamped Brainiac from just looking like a green cyborg into the more metallic shell. But that's neither here nor there. And then I'm trying to think some other villains that, I'm gonna mangle the pronunciation of this. Mr. Mxyzptlk, who was a imp from the sixth dimension who just simply wanted to play pranks and jokes on Superman. But this was my childhood. And Superman was about, truth, justice, the American way. Able to leap tall buildings with a single bound. It's a bird. It's a plane. It's Superman. He was the great American hero. And he was written that way. Now, meanwhile, society, and again, we're Gen Xers, right? Starting to become a little bit more cynical and sarcastic and maybe even having a bleaker worldview, right? So things start to turn. So I mentioned James Gunn and Zack Snyder. So they are both 1966. I'm 1974. So not quite 10 years older than me. But if I'm 10, reading a comic book, they're 18, right? They're in a different place. And if you wanted to go ahead and retain those readers, you had to be gradually moving it. I imagine the Zack Snyders and the James Gunns were the guys who were in high school and college still reading comic books. Here they are living in that world. So they must have continued to be interested in this kind of subject matter, right? So it becomes more mature. Well, another thing that DC had done was they created multiple universes. And they decided that they were going to just stop all of that. And they were going to have this signature event. And you're like, what does this all have to do with where we are today? And I'll explain. So in 1985, they launched a series called Crisis on Infinite Earths. And this was meant to be a clean slate. Clean slate. And it was effectively taking all of these universes, choosing which heroes lived and died, which villains lived and died, which Earths lived and died, and coalescing everything into what they were calling the Prime Earth. And the Prime Earth was going to be where all stories from that point on were being told. That meant new backgrounds for characters, new histories. And that led to I guess you could call it a closing on the book of what Superman had been. Okay. So you had Superman number 423 and Action Comics number 583. So think about this, 423 issues of this comic going all the way back to 39, 8, something like that. And Action Comics even longer, 583. So the final story of Superman, Whatever Happened to the Man of Tomorrow, which was written by an author called Alan Moore. If you know Alan Moore, he's done a lot of crazy stuff, including Swamp Thing and then Miracle Man, Marvel Man. If you ever read that, that's crazy. But he's kind of known as being a pretty dark writer, right? I mean, he looks like he's a dryad. Dryad? Is that the word I'm looking for? I think that's the word that I'm looking for. Druid. He looks like a druid, right? And he writes like a druid. And he kind of wrote all these kind of macabre stories and all those kind of things. But he writes this really earnest kind of closing of the chapter on what we had known as Superman. And it was meant to be everything that you believed that Superman had been, what he stood for, and ultimately resulted in a wink, wink, nudge, nudge. He ultimately ends up losing his superpowers, assuming another identity, and then moving on to live a normal life. Now, mind you have Crisis on Infinite Earths that happens. One of the key moments in Crisis on Infinite Earths was Crisis on Infinite Earths number 7. And this is the moment that comics changed for me as a, 11-year-old. And that was the death of Supergirl. And it was on the cover, I think of that issue or the following issue. And, heroes didn't really die in comic books. So again, I'm mentioning how like the sensibilities of the time had gone from comics being just for kids to something much darker. Heroes don't die. And Supergirl died. She died heroically, but you had like the greatest hero, Superman, absolutely devastated, in tears, not knowing what to do because Kryptonians don't die, right? So this had me hooked in a way, having emotions about comic book characters that I've said, okay, this is now becoming literature. It's because of stuff like this that I think Gen X is kind of the way that we are. Moments like these, which completely shift an art form into something new and worth discovering and exploring in a way that I hadn't before, because I was looking at it solely through the eyes of a child, and Superman, bright colors, and he saves the day. So in 1986, Superman was restarted in a miniseries called The Man of Steel, which was written and drawn by a guy by the name of John Byrne. John Byrne is an English artist, British, Well, I'm not sure which part of Britain he's from. I think he's English. And he was most well known for his run on a bunch of Marvel titles, Alpha Flight among them, the X-Men. His Chris Claremont, John Byrne run is considered one of the best, X-Men runs of all time. And his dream was to kind of go ahead and revamp Superman for a modern audience. And that's what he did. So upon the end of Crisis on Infinite Earths, all of the world is rebooted. So 1987, that first issue of Superman #1. Meanwhile, so I'm slightly reading off of an article that has some general timelines. The original Action Comics Superman. The original Superman series, which I mentioned was ending at number 423 with that, whatever happened to the Man of Tomorrow. Well, issue 424 was now renamed The Adventures of Superman, and that was being written by Marv Wolfman, who wrote Crisis on Infinite Earths and one of my favorite comic book series of all time, the New Teen Titans. And that was, dubbed Adventures of Superman, and that was drawn by Jerry Ordway, who had done all the inks on Crisis on Infinite Earths, except for like the first 2 issues, which is like Dick Giordano. I know I'm getting into total dork stuff. That was George Perez art. I preferred Dick Giordano. I think that Jerry Ordway's inks are a little bit overbearing, but anyway, as the main artist, I was good with it. I like his art. I think he was being inked by Carl Kessel and maybe Klaus Janson at one point. Anyway, so you now have this new Superman. And they're trying to mix in some of the modern sensibilities and even how Superman looked and presented himself. And, the hair was different. It was a more modern hairstyle. Clark Kent was different. Clark no longer decided to hide his physique. It was, hey, I was like the star football player back in Smallville, right? And now I'm just this big jacked guy. And that was okay. He was no longer, he was still kind of dorky, but it wasn't played so much of the comedy of he was like this wallflower, this shrinking violet as this major contrast to the characters, right? So then you have Superman. He ends up, dying in Superman number 75 when he's killed by Doomsday. And then, he comes back to life. He's got the black suit, long hair, blah, 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 blah. And you have some, you have a reboot, New 52. I think that was in 2006. New snazzy costume, got rid of the stupid trunks. That to me was like the best part. It was a more modern look, but you can keep the basis of the hero. And before I forget, the Kurt Swan art that I mentioned was clearly the biggest inspiration in what all of us would consider, I think, our Superman growing up. And that's Christopher Reeves. And Christopher Reeves was Superman, right? He was. And that's where we're kind of going to pause right here. We're going to pause right here because now we're going to get into the Snyderverse. So, yeah, just Christopher Reeve, he's the man. And if there's anything else from the timeline that I want to delve into at all. Okay. So there's another thing that did happen with him here right around 1980. Yeah, it was 86, 87, around that time. There was also a comic book series that came out that was called The Dark Knight Returns. And this was written by a gentleman by the name of Frank Miller. Now, that's going to be really important when we talk about the Snyderverse. So we're going to put a pin in that. We're going to come back to Frank Miller, who writes some pretty dark tales, oftentimes extremely ultra-violent, vulgar, sexualized, like you name it. That's kind of been his wheelhouse. Anyone who's seen Sin City, the 300, these are all his entities. And what's also kind of interesting about it is Zack Snyder also did 300. And I mentioned Alan Moore. Alan Moore wrote The Watchmen, also something that was directed by Zack Snyder. So 2000 and, oh gosh, what year was that? 2000 and, let's see. Was that 2013? No, hold on. So let's see here. The first foray, 2013. Okay, it was. So 2013. So there was much hubbub because you are looking at a period of time where, you know, the new 52 had happened, kind of a new look at Superman, and that ran from, let's see. So 2011 is actually when the new 52 came out. So Zack Snyder's Man of Steel. The key part here was the casting of Henry Cavill. Now, Henry Cavill, to me, is just the second best that you get to Christopher Reeves as far as looking the part and being able to carry himself believably, in part because of his build and his frame. So that's why I mentioned earlier how he had been drawn, right? Superman was always drawn very, very barrel-chested, and he kind of morphed in some of the different art styles into having huge arms, sometimes freakishly large arms where they focused more on the upper body than him being, you know, thick through the lats, right? And Henry Cavill comes along in this Zack Snyder vehicle. And Zack Snyder's sensibilities, not only Man of Steel, but also his follow-up, which was the Affleck Batman in Batman versus Superman, was somewhat based upon the Frank Miller stories. Now, I mentioned that Frank Miller did things more on a dark side, right? And Zack Snyder kind of attacked Superman in the same way as he had the other properties that he'd done within like the DC and comics universe. And even the tone was not necessarily like you think of with superhero movies, which are often very brightly colored, right? So even you go back to, you know, the Christopher Reeve Superman, there was something that was so stark and shocking about, you know, the blue and the red and the yellow of his costume in Metropolis at that time, right? Just how things were filmed back then. And it was just, whoa, here he is. He's Superman, right? It was a startling contrast to kind of the things that were around him, of how much he stood out with these bright colors. And Zack Snyder went with a much more muted palette, which is basically his style. And he was trying to keep with this kind of darker tone. So, of course, the moment that everyone, I guess, kind of shits on is the big ending of the Man of Steel. So anyone who hasn't seen it, there's a great battle between Superman and General Zod, who is also from Krypton, and he is laying waste to the city. Superman and Zod fight all over the city, resulting in significant loss of life, which will be a major point of Batman versus Superman. And Zod is about to heat vision some just human civilians, and he won't stop, won't close his eyes. Obviously, Superman can't put his hand over his eyes because they're Kryptonian, it'll burn through him. And he does what he feels is the only thing that he could do, and he snaps Zod's neck. Now, if you go all the way back to 1986, is it 86? 1986, and whatever happened to the Man of Tomorrow, you have to understand that Alan Moore, who is known for writing dark material, knew that there was one key thing about Superman. Superman actually accidentally kills someone while trying to, save people, and feels as though this is something that needs to be punished. He sacrifices himself because he's gone ahead and he's taken a life, and that was something he swore that he would never do, right? That's a huge piece of the mythos of Superman. And Alan Moore completely eschews his darker tendencies to say Superman couldn't abide that, right? So here, Zack Snyder decided that he was going to put Superman in such a position that he had no choice but to go ahead and take the life of what would be like one of the last Kryptonians, right? That was the whole crux of the story. And then he's left with this deep sense of grief, of loss, and the fact that he had to go ahead and take a life. Now, I get what he's trying to do. I guess he's trying to add some I don't know. I think I already used the word gravitas, but you don't need to dirty up Superman. You don't need to. Like, that's the whole point of the character. Like, you didn't need to do that. Do I understand it in the context of the film and what he's going for? Yeah, I mean, I guess. I mean, that was a choice that he made. But in keeping with the darkness of all of it, he then mixes up your Dark Knight Returns for this battle between Batman and Superman, and then you throw in the Death of Superman arc where they introduce Doomsday, now retconning him to be a offshoot clone of the dead Zod, and it's a big mishmash that has a lot of great action sequences. It introduces Wonder Woman into the whole thing, but kind of a mess. Kind of a mess. Enjoyable as a superhero movie, but in my opinion, you're completely wasting Henry Cavill. And then, of course, you get his Justice League, meaning Zack Snyder's Justice League. Again, very dark in tone, really way too serious, right? So that's the whole thing that's always been interesting, is that the Marvel Universe has kept things, I don't want to say light, but plenty of humor until it needed to get serious. And because they were saving the more poignant moments, it made them more poignant. When they wanted you to really emote and feel something about these characters, it was built so carefully, because otherwise, superhero movie, they're the good guys, you know who the bad guys are, and there needs to be a resolution. Oh, wait, bad guy wins. You think about the time where, Thanos does the snap, everyone disappears. I mean, that's an emotional moment. It's an emotional gut punch. I always think about the scene with Peter Quill when he finds out that Gamora has died, and Thanos tell you, I had to do it. It was something I had to do. And Chris Pratt's character as Peter Quill, he's like, no, you didn't. No, you didn't. And he almost blows the entire thing for everyone, and basically, in many ways, does. He basically causes the snap because the woman that he loved was killed for, in his opinion, for no good reason, right? So that's the skill, is to not have it so dark, and oh, wait, now we're going to get even bleaker. I don't know what you get out of that. You have to have that balance. And really all they did for Justice League was, okay, Ezra Miller's Flash is supposed to be some, I don't know, comic relief. And then your Aquaman, played by Jason Momoa, is just supposed to be like this kind of meathead party boy. Okay. Cyborg, bro, you're so dark. You're so dark. I loved the new T-Titans because, Cyborg was kind of cool, man. You know what I mean? Like, he did say booyah as much as the actor, I'm forgetting his name, didn't like it. But it gives you levity. If you only have a dark tone the whole time, well, it's just not as enjoyable, right? I do like the Snyder cut. I've seen, both versions of it. It's wonderful for what it is, but I just feel as though it was a tremendous wasted opportunity of tremendous talents who all played their characters very, very well within how they were written, but how much better could they have been utilized? So the whole key thing is that if you get the character of Superman right, well, let's just go here. So that's where I said, can James Gunn save Superman? So I'm just going to move one thing here on my, my computer. Come on there, buddy. Why don't you want to move for me? Hello? Why aren't you moving? All right, I might be able to do this here. Okay, hold on. I'm trying to reorder my my page here, and it's not really letting me. And this will only take a second, hopefully. And now I can move it. Okay, so James Gunn. Now, also born in 1966. So here you have another boomer, born the same year as Zack Snyder. Now, I already mentioned the tone of, right, Guardians of the Galaxy. So think about some of the things that James Gunn has done if you're not familiar with his work. So Guardians of the Galaxy 1, 2, and 3. All three of those movies were, I don't want to say they were unexpected hits, but it was certainly one of the lesser known entities in Marvel Comics, unless you were really into Marvel. And he took these characters and through a mixture of great writing, great action, great lore building, like really giving you kind of a background and how all these characters were going to have an impact on the greater story, which is actually with Thanos and leading right into all the Avengers stuff, right? But there was such a sense of wonderment and levity, but they were building these characters who, as much as they were sarcastic and somewhat violent and irreverent, they had such, by the end of it, they became a team and a family. So you can have all this clever writing. You could definitely write it in a way that has some adult themes and things that are appealing to people across generations and still have it be fun, but still have it be really emotional. You want to have an emotional connection. So James Gunn, his Guardians of the Galaxy stuff, outstanding, start to finish. And of all the Marvel releases over the last, year, Guardians of the Galaxy, I think, was the top grossing or second top grossing of anything that Marvel Studios has released. Why? You got to know these characters. You really cared about them and you wanted to see how their story ended because it was positioned to be the last round of the Guardians of the Galaxy. Tremendous. So you may have heard that James Gunn had been fired from Disney because of some tweets. And so we talked about it last week, things you maybe can't say, shouldn't say. There are probably some third rails you shouldn't touch. And he definitely touched them, at least put a little pinky on them. Meant to be in humor. Certain things, like I mentioned, like kids, you don't go there kind of thing. But DC took a shot because they had another vehicle that they kind of wanted him to work on. And he did, ended up being the Suicide Squad. So anyone who would have seen the original Suicide Squad movie, which was directed by David Ayer, who I think was, what was his first movie? I feel like he did a Denzel movie. But I don't want to get it wrong here. Always like to do a little check here. Training Day. Yeah, it is Training Day. Oh, he was the screenplay writer for Training Day. Okay, because that was what? Anton Fuqua? Is that how you pronounce his name? Fuqua. I think it's Fuqua. Yeah, he directed it, but it was written by David Ayer, who then also directed Harsh Times, Street Kings, End of Watch, Sabotage. He did Bright. I kind of liked Bright. That was on Netflix. That was like Dungeons and Dragons meets like Bad Boys. It was kind of fun. Let's see. He did Fury, the Tax Collector. Anyway, he's done a bunch of stuff. But that first Suicide Squad movie kind of got tepid reviews. I would agree that it was okay, but it introduced us to Margot Robbie as Harley Quinn. Well, you give a character that is really built perfectly. You have Joel Kinnaman as Major Flag, and give James Gunn these characters. Some of the most offbeat, and anyone who knows like the Suicide Squad, like their whole history is they're criminals who are then tasked by the U.S. government to carry out impossible missions, suicide missions. And if they fail to comply, a bomb that's in their brain will be detonated and they will go boom. And again, you have this mishmash group of ragtag characters, some of them criminally insane, some of them homicidal, all these different characters. And they're all looking for redemption. Right. And that's kind of what the arc of the Guardians was too. Like each one of the characters in Guardians of the Galaxy was trying to find some form of redemption for either what they had been or what they've done, what they aspired to be. And I don't know why James Gunn writes this so well, but there's such heart behind it. And he made this lovable group of losers heroes, because even though they were bad guys who were being tasked by the government under duress to go on this mission, when the people of the country that they were in were being faced with destruction from Starro, who is an extraterrestrial starfish that also has the ability to take over minds and can also grow to unimaginable size. An awesome old school Justice League villain, by the way. There's this great cover, I think, from 1980. I want to say like maybe 84, 85 of all the Justice League with little Starros over their faces, taking over their brain with the big Starro in the background. It's amazing piece of artwork. But anyway, they all decide that, they're going to defy orders because they can't let all of these innocent people be led to slaughter, because the U.S. government has now been like, not our problem, not the mission, leave it, let others take care of it, kind of thing. You know what I mean? And these are the bad guys who have been forced to be good guys. And it also introduced us to John Cena's Peacemaker, which, by the way, I have a great poster down here in my basement somewhere of the Charlton Heroes. So if you hadn't heard of Peacemaker, I have. Great character, been up and down in his history throughout the years, but John Cena's rendition is fantastic for that TV show that's available on Max. If you haven't seen it, it's tremendous. Just for the opening credits, brilliant, freaking brilliant. And James Gunn was involved with the series as well. And then he was given the reins of all DC. So now this question that I asked at the beginning: can James Gunn save Superman? Now, what I mean by save Superman is the character has been pigeonholed, rightly or wrongly, as being one of the toughest to write. Why? Because he is contrary to almost everything happening in popular culture. Like in real life, in society, he doesn't fit, because it's foreign to think of someone having literally absolute power and not using it for ulterior purposes, not using it for self-serving purposes, being able to literally conquer the world, make themselves emperor, and choosing not to. There's such an inherent goodness with Superman. What would you do if you had unimaginable power? You had heat vision, super hearing, super vision, super speed, cold breath, right? Super breath, freeze things, flying, just unimaginably strong, invulnerable to pretty much any form of damage, can fly into space, can fly deep under the water, swim deep under the water, pretty much absolutely a deity, right? And that's kind of how Superman's been written, right? He's been deified. He is a god amongst men. Yet, the reason that he often gets these kind of messianic comparisons to someone like, I don't know, Jesus, for example, is what if you had the power to call down great power? Like, with Jesus, it was call upon the name of God. He himself is God. We can get into the whole Trinity thing. But anyway, point, having the power and not using it, because that's not the right thing to do, right? Jesus on the cross, hey, if you're a son of God, why don't you go ahead and save yourself? Right? No, that's not how the mission works, right? So same thing with Superman. I could take over everything, but I'm not going to. And that's where I think it becomes difficult, because one, how do you give him enemies? Like consistent enemies that are actually threats, right? Now, mind you, we all read, I actually haven't read a comic book since 2019 in my last house. It was during the rebirth phase because Wally West Flash was coming back. That's my Flash from the 80s. Anyway, those of us who have been interested in comics and all that, kind of what we're looking for is, kind of lost my train of thought when I was like, oh, all of us who read comics, but I haven't actually, and I kind of shut my own brain off for a second. Anyway, but Superman has unimaginable power. He is the best of the best. He was written in many ways as being an American hero. It was like Superman was what America aspired to be, and Batman was the fascist version of it, right? Multiple heroes at times have said Batman's a fascist, right? Superman's pure freedom, doing what's right at all times, unconditionally, when he doesn't have to. How do you write that in a way that people don't go, this is such a bland milquetoast character? Oh, I was talking about villains. Like, you know, it doesn't matter if you're watching a movie, a TV show, you kind of know that the main character isn't actually going to die. So how do you believably put them in peril? Now you add to it a character that really can't be beaten. Like the only ones that have are like such exceptionally strong villains, usually Kryptonian, and you're gonna play that out, right? There's only so many Kryptonian stories you can write. So what do you do with him? That's where Zack Snyder, I think, missed the boat a little bit. he wanted to dirty him up a little bit, put a little scuff on the old Superman, thinking that maybe that was more believable or relatable. Yet you had Henry Cavill, who completely had the ability to play the Superman as the archetype, the look, the facial expressions, all of it, right? Because the whole thing with Christopher Reeve is that Christopher Reeve's Superman could have that look where he's like pissed, like he's mad, right? But the rest of the time, it was like very lighthearted, right? Even in those situations that he would be in with, like, you know, someone who's trying to shoot a gun at him, and he can just, you know, squish the gun. He had that little glimmer in his eye. Why? He didn't have to worry about anything. Like, why can't he just be kind of easygoing, right? And that's what Superman is supposed to represent. And that's what Christopher Reeve did so well. You know, just got this little bit of swagger, right? But not arrogant, right? Could be, but aw shucks, I'm just a farm boy from Kansas. And hey, really wish you wouldn't do that. I have amazing superpowers, so I'm going to, you know, ask you to maybe stop doing crime, kind of thing. And people still try to shoot a bullet at him and, you know, ting, slap it away and send him to jail. Superhero, right? Without having to beat the shit out of him like Batman does, just as a comparison. I think James Gunn. Oh, I mentioned Frank Miller, right? So Frank Miller was the inspiration for Zack Snyder. Frank Miller made Batman a fascist, like dark, violent, vengeful, right? More so than anything you can imagine, right? It made Gotham a much darker place, made the Joker even scarier, like made it dark. Because that's what Frank Miller does so well, right? But not Superman. Frank Miller retained the big blue Boy Scout, Superman. He was still Superman. He didn't change that because you can't change it. It's actually why Batman in that comic book was able to get the upper hand. Mind you, he cheated, little help from Oliver Queen, aka the Green Arrow, and a whole bunch of kryptonite and a whole bunch of technology, but ultimately Superman had just recovered from like detonating with a nuclear bomb, saving people. Literally got nuked and then had to completely rebuild through the, you know, the red sun, yellow sun, whatever it is. Yellow sun goes ahead. He gets the good vibe energy radiation and he recovers and he's Superman, but he had just come back from that, probably a little weakened, and, you know, Batman exploits that. But even Frank Miller and all the darkness, like the very end of the first Dark Knight series, Superman knows that Batman is not actually dead, and he gives a little wink to Carrie, who's Robin at the time, right? Because he's just a good dude. Batman is his friend. He didn't want to fight him. Just, he's Superman. So even the art, like the writers who try to go into this darker realm, this adult realm, don't fuck with Superman. that's the guy. Like, that's the character. So James Gunn, he understands that I think you can make a earnest, honest to goodness, aw shucks Superman that, if written properly, doesn't seem corny, doesn't seem forced, but it's all about how you tell the story. And he has this amazing knack of taking these characters and giving them all the elements needed to be relatable, to garner sympathy. Like, that's the whole thing. I think he'll be able to garner sympathy for whatever villain puts Superman in peril. Maybe he's going to put the people that he loves in peril, which is another thing that always, we'll get to Superman, because he's always going to be caring about, Lois or Jimmy or Ma and Pa Kent or Lana or Perry, like whoever it is, he's going to do his best, like, help people. James Gunn has to be the guy to do it. And I think his whole frame of reference is so different, but that's where I think there is this, if there's going to be anything that is a split in Gen X, I do think it is the cynicism that burns through the core of someone. Cynical in all things. Very bleak. Don't really believe in faith and hope and love, right? There are some among us who are like that, so cerebral to the point of being a little bit less than emotionally available, right? And then I think there are, and they relate to the darkness of things, right? We were goth before anyone was goth. Let's be honest. I mean, we were dark, right? Some of us got really dark, and our music and our film, like, it all shows that. It demonstrates that within the art. But I've mentioned before that as much as I'm cynical, as much as I appreciate the darker things in life, I'm also very optimistic, and I like humor, and I don't like necessarily, look, I do bust balls, right? But I don't necessarily like mean-spirited humor. Doesn't mean that I won't laugh at it. Like, just like I mentioned last week with comedy, you need to have that blend of sensibilities, that blend of, hey, there's going to be something that is, I don't know, whatever world-ending menace is going to be happening in the James Gunn Superman, right? Whatever that is, there has to be this hopeful energy, this bright-colored, huge guy who completely believes in mankind, who completely believes in humanity, and that people are inherently good. The virtues and values that were instilled upon him on a farm in Smallville, and how he has taken that with him into the world and tries to use investigative journalism to bring to light injustices that are happening in Metropolis and around the world, right? You can mix all of those things. Superman is nothing else if earnest and honest and true, and a character that has always been written to be the best of all of us. Now, that being said, James Gunn also has a lot of unique opportunities if he chooses to work with the multiverse, because one of the things that is fascinating to a lot of people is when you turn that Superman archetype. Keep Superman as he is, but if you want to use multiversal versions of it, James Gunn did a movie called Brightburn, which I still haven't seen, which is weird, which is what happens if a Superman from another planet, like an alien from another planet, crash lands here, gets adopted, but inherently is homicidal because the whole mission is to go to Earth and take over. Now, there's been some versions of the Superman story that have been made that way, which is the intention of sending Kal-El to Earth on Earth 3. Ultraman is to take over, right? People are fascinated with the dark Superman. There's the Injustice Superman, who is a dictator on that planet. People think that's so super cool and neat. I mean, it's a fascinating character, but you can do that. And if nothing else, hey, James Gunn, give us Superboy Prime. And anyone who knows who Superboy Prime is knows that that is the baddest of the bad of the multiversal Supermen. He is the bad one, right? but also for my money, just very quickly. If we ever get a Crisis on Infinite Earths, again, James Gunn, I know you're not going to hear this, but in the event that you do, Tyler Laughlin, Marissa Benoist, the Superman and Supergirl from the CW series, you have them be the versions of Superman and Supergirl that recreate the Crisis on Infinite Earths. That moment, you will have the entire theater in absolute tears, devastating. There would be a decade's worth of goodwill and trust that's built into the characters of that whole Arrowverse, which I think is a missed opportunity if they're not incorporated in some way into multiversal stories in the new DC continuity. But anyway, James Gunn, if you do happen to hear this, since your name is going to be the title of this particular podcast, hey, please reach out to me, and I would love to have you on the show. Also, just in case it happens, Kevin Smith, love to have you on the show as well, because you yourself have written a script for Superman, which anyone who has seen the Flash movie will know that there is a segment that was based upon the unfilmed, Tim Burton was to be directed, Kevin Smith penned, Superman Lives, starring none other than Nicolas Cage. Think about that. We could have got a Tim Burton, Nicolas Cage Superman, written by Kevin Smith. Amazing. So Kevin Smith, James Gunn, open invite. Come on to the show. Love to have you. And how would you go ahead and reach out to me? You know how you would do that? You would email me at stuckinthemiddlepod@yahoo.com. You can find me on Instagram, X, and YouTube at StuckPodX. Head on over to the Facebook page, Stuck in the Middle, a Gen X podcast. Please like, comment, share, leave 5-star reviews, and most importantly, please subscribe to the podcast. So until next time, slackers, up, and away.